14 parts in, we've covered REST through webonyx.xml and a real router matching a URL to a service contract method. GraphQL is a completely different front door into the same Magento, and today we trace it start to finish, from an incoming HTTP request to the exact line of real framework code that turns a resolver class name, written as plain text inside a schema file, into an actual, live PHP method call. Every file and every line comes from a real get checkout of the pin 2.4.9 tag. Welcome back to Magento Development Deep Dive. Today's part is GraphQL, how a query string becomes real product data. We'll walk the real front controller that receives every GraphQL request, the real query processor that hands a parsed query to the webonyx GraphQL library, a real schema.graphqls field declaration using the actual @resolver directive, and the real chain of framework classes that reads that directive's class name and calls resolve on it. We finish at a real, currently shipping Resolver catalogs products resolver so you can see the whole pipeline land on genuine application code, not a toy example. 5 things should click by the end. How GraphQL.php, the single real front controller behind every GraphQL request, receives and dispatches that request. What QueryProcessor actually does once it has a parsed query and a built schema object in hand. How a field declared in schema.graphqls, using the real @resolver directive, names a PHP class as plain text inside a string. How PromiseFactory is the real class that reads that string, builds the object, and wires up the call that eventually runs. And what a real, currently shipping Resolver catalog's own products resolver actually returns once it's invoked. Strip away the code and every GraphQL field resolution goes through 5 stages. GraphQL.php, the real front controller every request hits first, whatever the query actually asks for. Parse and schema, a real query parser turns the request body into an AST, while a real schema generator builds the full type system from every module schema.graphqls file. QueryProcessor hands both of those, plus a context object, straight to the webonyx GraphQL library's own execute query function. @resolver directive, buried inside the generated schema, each field that needs real data carries a real PHP class name as plain text. And PromiseFactory, the class that actually reads that name, builds the object through Magento's own object manager, and calls resolve on it. A few things help before we dig in. Part 14 is the closest relative RESTs. webonyx.xml and GraphQL schema.graphqls solve the same problem, mapping an external request onto internal PHP, through 2 genuinely different transports. Part 6, on service contracts, is useful too. The real resolver we trace today calls a real search result object built from the same repository and interface pattern covered back then. Either a real Magento 2.4.9 checkout, or the GitHub tag open in a browser tab, so you can follow along in the real files. No prior GraphQL experience is needed at all. We explain the schema definition language syntax as it comes up. This is the real dispatch method on the GraphQL class, and it's the single front controller every GraphQL request runs through, whether it's a query, a mutation, or an introspection call. It pulls the request body apart, parses the raw query string into a real parsed query object, tells a query fields helper which fields were actually asked for a genuine performance optimization so the schema generator doesn't build types nobody requested, generates the full schema, and hands everything to QueryProcessor's process method. Everything downstream in this part happens inside that one process call. This is the real process method, and it's a genuinely thin wrapper. After a few real query complexity checks, length, alias count, field count, all worth knowing about. If you've ever hit a rejected query, it calls GraphQL::execute query, a static method from the third-party webonyx GraphQL library Magento depends on, not framework code Magento wrote itself. Magento's own job here is assembling the schema and the context correctly and formatting whatever comes back. The actual field-by-field walk through the query happens inside that library call, using the schema object dispatch just built. This is the real query types products field, straight from catalog's own schema.graphqls file, trimmed only to fit on screen. Every argument and the resolver line are copied exactly. The @resolver directive is the piece that matters most here, a real PHP class name, Magento CatalogGraphQL model resolver products, written as ordinary text inside this schema definition language file. Nothing about GraphQL itself understands PHP classes. This directive is entirely a Magento convention, read and acted on by Magento's own schema generation code, which is exactly what the next 2 scenes trace. This is the real getFieldConfig method, and it's what turns the schema.graphqls field we just saw into an array the webonyx library understands. Field, here, is a real config object already carrying the parsed @resolver class name as a plain string property, populated when Magento first reads every module's schema file. The one line that matters is the if block, when a field actually has a resolver declared, this method calls PromiseFactory create, passing the whole field object along, and stores whatever comes back under the resolve key. The exact key webonyx's library checks when it's time to actually fetch this field's data. This is the real create method, and it answers the hook question this part opened with. Field get resolver is that plain string, Magento /CatalogGraphQl /model /resolver /products, straight out of the schema file. ResolverFactory create by class takes that string and builds a genuine object out of it, the same way part 3's dependency injection container builds anything else. The return closure is what webonyx actually calls once a client's query touches the products field, and its very last line is $resolver resolved. The real method call this whole pipeline exists to reach. This is the real, complete resolver interface, and every GraphQL resolver class in Magento, core or custom, implements exactly this one method. Field is the same config object from the last 3 scenes. Context carries request scoped data like the current store and customer. Info is a real GraphQL resolve info object describing where this field sits in the overall query. Value is whatever the parent field already resolved to, letting a child field read data its parent already fetched. And args is the real, validated arguments the client actually sent search, filter, pageSize, current page, straight from the schema.graphqls arguments list 2 scenes back. This is the real resolve method on CatalogGraphQl's resolver, the exact class named in schema.graphqls 3 scenes ago. It validates the real args array current page and pageSize both have to be positive, and either search or filter has to be present. The same checks live in the pin source right now. Then it delegates to a real search query object, itself built on service contracts from part 6, and returns a plain PHP array, total count, the actual product items, and page info. That array is exactly what webonyx expects back from a resolve call, and it's what ultimately becomes the JSON a client receives. A few things trip people up here. A field with no @resolver directive at all isn't broken. Webonyx just reads the matching key straight out of its parent's already resolved array, no PHP method runs at all, which is why so many simple GraphQL types in Magento carry no resolver class whatsoever. Query field set query, back in dispatch, deliberately runs before the schema even gets generated. It's a genuine optimization limiting which types get built for this one query, not just cosmetic ordering. The resolver class name in schema.graphqls is plain text, checked by PHP's own class loading only when that field actually gets requested. A typo there fails at request time, not when you run a static analysis pass. And a resolve method returning a plain PHP array, like products does, is completely normal. The value wrapper type only matters once you're doing deferred or batched resolution, a topic for a future part. Let's pull this back together. GraphQL.php's dispatch method is the single real front controller every GraphQL request runs through, parsing the query and handing off to the processor. QueryProcessor's process method hands the fully built schema straight to the real webonyx GraphQL library's own execute query call. Magento assembles the pieces, the library walks the query. Fields declared in schema.graphqls name a resolver class as plain text through the real @resolver directive. Fields ::getFieldConfig reads that string off a real config object and wires it into a resolve callback the library will actually call. And PromiseFactory's create method is the exact line where that callback builds a real object and calls resolve on it, landing on genuine, currently shipping application code like CatalogGraphQl's resolver. That's the real machinery behind Magento's GraphQL pipeline, straight from a git checkout of the pin 2.4.9 source, every file and line verified against that exact commit. Part 16 moves into indexer's full reindex versus schedule mode, and what actually happens inside Magento when either one runs. If you want the rest of this series as it publishes, subscribe now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 16.